Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the sixth installment of our The Future is Intersectional Black Women Interrogating Technology speaker series. My name is Tamara Pearson. I am the director of the Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM here at Spelman College, and I am so excited for the fireside chat that you all have joined us for this evening. I do have to say that when we started this series, we had a dream list of who would be our speakers, and I have just been amazed by how many people from that dream list that we have been able to get. And two of those women are with us this evening, Dr. Raquel Hill of our very own Spelman College, and Dr. Latanya Sweeney of Harvard University. And I do have to tell a quick story about Dr. Hill, just to kind of emphasize how special she is to me. I was telling Raquel that when I did a talk about 2 years ago, I did a talk where I talked about the importance of Black women in computer science, especially as role models to the next generation that are coming up. And one of the women that I featured in that talk was Raquel Hill. So she has been a advisor and mentor to me long before I even knew her personally, and she does not disappoint on a personal level. So I do want to share a few housekeeping things before I turn it over to our wonderful speakers. Number one is that we do have a Q&A button. So please, if you have questions for our speakers, please place those questions in the Q&A. And then I also want to let you know that I'm so excited to be able to share with you that through generous funding from one of our partners, the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, we can confirm that we will be able to continue this speaker series into the fall semester. So I hope that you stay tuned for what's coming in the fall. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Raquel Hill and Dr. Latanya Sweeney.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here. And it's definitely an honor to have this conversation with Dr. Latanya Sweeney, and I'm just going to call her Latanya. We've known each other for many years now, and she has always been an inspiration. Even prior to me meeting Dr. Sweeney, I was a graduate student at Harvard. And while a graduate student at Harvard, I was told by a professor there, you should meet this woman. She's a student at MIT. And that was late 90s, early 2000. And it wasn't until 2007 that I actually met her when she came to give a talk at Indiana University, where I was a professor. And I was amazed by her delivery and just her knowledge and everything. And she was so inspiring. And I say today that that was still the best talk that I've ever heard, and she is just as amazing today as she was then, even more inspiring in all that she's accomplished, pioneering fields in data privacy and igniting new research in the areas of algorithmic fairness, and not just for the academic work that she does, but also for how she gives back and how she supports other researchers in the field. And I know this personally just for when I was on sabbatical, how she invited me to come into her research lab in her class and see her at work, and also other young researchers that I've sent her way and the support that she has given them. So she is the total package. And I appreciate and love you, Latanya. And I just look forward to this conversation with you this evening. So welcome, Latanya.
Thank you. You know, it's so amazing. Well, first of all, that no one can live up to that introduction, but it's just fantastic to be here. I thank you so much, Raquel. It's wonderful to have you. Dr. Pearson said it well. You don't disappoint ever on a personal level. You're just amazing, and and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I wanted to start out first. I want you to, tell us just a little bit about how you became interested in technology and computing. Like, where did this interest come from? What kind of motivated you and inspired you to explore this area?
Well, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and from a very young age, all I ever wanted to do was mathematics, which was very odd because most of the people around me, wanted to be lots of other things, professionals and so forth. But I was the only one that wanted to be a mathematician. I was raised by my great grandparents. They didn't understand it, but they always supported it. Later in high school, I took a class, in fact, because I had sort of exhausted all the math classes in my school and had been taking college math classes. But there was one class I hadn't taken, and it was a computer class. And when I took that computer class, I loved it because everything that I enjoyed about math, the certainty of it, the idea that there was a right answer, was the same thing that happens in computer programming, except computer programming did things in the real world. And it made all the effort come alive. And so from that moment forward, I just wanted to be a computer scientist.
I think it's interesting that you and I kind of have a similar story, as it's like, how did I become interested in computer science? I thought I would be a mathematician. And until I took the one programming class in high school my senior year, and I declared at that point that I'm going to be a computer scientist. And so it's interesting how we came to computing in the same way.
Yeah.
Now, I know that, and I mentioned earlier about how you pioneered this area of data privacy. And I don't know if you can say that that was the first time that you were looking at how technology impacted society. But can you tell us a little bit about that work and the re-identification work that you did with Governor William Weld, and what you understood, or what were your findings from that work, and where are we right now regarding this, and why should we be concerned? What should we be concerned about as it relates to data privacy?
Well, I mean, that's a lot. Let me
Yeah.
start from the beginning of
Okay.
you
Yeah.
said. So with that origin that we just talked about, me as a very young person wanting to be a computer scientist, I absolutely loved technology. I felt it was going to be the great equalizer. It was really going to bring forth a better society and the best in society. And so eventually I become a PhD student in computer science at MIT, and I'm busy building my thinking machine, making great progress. And one day I heard an ethicist say computers are evil. And so I said, what? Let me explain this to her, because clearly she doesn't understand computers. And so we sat there and she began to foretell the future. She talked about a time when the social contracts were being broken. At that time, the big issue was that hard disk drive space was so cheap. It was just so easy to share data, and people who had never even had access to data could have it. And she began to say, look, this is going to destroy, it's going to be the beginning of the end of many of our social and historical protections and norms. So I said, so we needed an example. She gave an example of health data that had been captured about state employees, their families, and retirees. And she said, look, this is a good example. Even now, they've got this data. They've already given some out to researchers. They've sold this data to industry. And, people could start blackmailing judges. People could have it could have all kinds of impacts. And I look at the fields of the data. I said, well, yeah, but it's doesn't have anyone's name on it, doesn't have anyone's social security number or address. Look, maybe it should be anonymous, and look at all the benefits that you could get from sharing this health data. And she says, well, it looks anonymous, but is it? And that turned out to be a really great question. It had month, day, and year of birth, gender, and 5-digit zip code. And so I do this math in my head. People live 365 days. I'm sorry, there are 365 days in a year. Let's say people live 100 years. That's 36,500. And in the data, there were two genders. So that's 73,000 possible combinations. But the typical 5-digit zip code only has about 25,000 people. That meant that that combination, month, day, and year of birth, gender, and 5-digit zip code would be unique for most people in the United States. So I'm trying to prove my point, but I'm kind of disproving my point. So I wanted to know if this was really true. So William Weld was the governor of Massachusetts at that time, and his information was in the data. He had collapsed and not a lot was known about it. So I went down to City Hall. I got the Cambridge voter list. It cost me $20 and it came on two 5.25-inch floppy drives, a floppy disk. And sure enough, 6 people had his date of birth. Only 3 of them were men, and he was the only one in that 5-digit zip code. That meant his date of birth, gender, and zip code was unique for him in the voter list. It was unique for him in the health data, and I could put his name to his medical record. And then I just did an experiment, a model around the United States, and found that the majority of the population, 87% of us, are unique by date of birth, gender, and zip code. About a month later, I'm testifying in DC on this very experiment, because it wasn't just that one health data that was being conducted that way. That was how it was done around the world. That was the best practice around the world. And what I had just demonstrated in that experiment was that the historical protections that we had around sharing data were no longer applicable, that we were already sharing data beyond what our protections allowed. Here in the United States, it happened at exactly the moment we were deciding what was going to become known as the Hipaa privacy rule. And so this example is cited in the preamble of the original Hipaa privacy rule. And in fact, regulations around the world changed. And so in New Zealand and lots of other countries, that example of the Weld experiment is cited and sort of launched this whole field of data privacy. Now that sounds exciting. And the things for you to take away from that, though, is that, look, notice how it was a simple experiment that exposed the unforeseen, and and people really came to respond to that. The bad news, though, is even despite sort of launching data privacy, we still haven't solved the privacy problem.
And I think that is the bad news. And I think that I want to back up a little bit and just even talk about the ethicists kind of challenging computing, and sometimes you think that people are just they're just coming out of left field. But I think if we can, where I think the solutions actually come, or the interesting problems come, is when you bring people from diverse backgrounds together to have a conversation about a topic, because they're looking at it, their lens is totally different from ours. And I guess without that, that challenge, that provocative statement of computers are gonna, ruin the world, or it's gonna, they're evil or something like that, and it sparked your interest. You didn't dismiss it. You're saying, well, let me think about it. And I think if anything that we need to take away from that is that we need to come together, people of different thoughts coming together to think about some of the technology issues, that we're facing today, so that we can have a robust and meaningful conversation and explore, the issues and hopefully come up with some solutions. And unfortunately, like you say, there's the issue of privacy and how to protect that data. We still have that challenge, and we have yet to address it. But if not for that work, and if not for the coming together of minds that were looking at this from totally different perspectives, we wouldn't actually have that. So I think that in itself is, it's a very interesting thing. And so from there, I want to move on. I'm going to fast forward but I'm going to go backwards, right? So how I'm going to do this is that you are working on a novel, not a novel, but a book right now that's autobiographical, would you say?
Well, it's intellectually autobiographical, meaning it's sort of about my intellectual journey through these spaces of challenges of technology, society, conflicts,
Yeah.
and what we've learned about them.
Okay. And so I want to talk about, I have to ask you about technocracy, right? I want you to break that term down for me. But I also, in the book, in the first chapter, you're talking about technology and advances in technology with, the camcorder. And if we compare that to, what we can do now with the smartphone, and I want you to tell the story that you're telling in the book, but also, with the compare and contrast with what we're seeing even today. But talk from the context even of privacy when we think about it. But first, I want you to begin with technocracy. Tell me what technocracy is. I'm
Well,
intrigued.
okay. Well, I mean, the way to think about this is technology design is sort of the new policymaker. We didn't elect them. We don't vote for them. We don't even know their names. But the arbitrary design decisions they make and the technology they create dictate the rules that we live by. And we can give lots of example. Twitter's redefinition of what is free speech. Now we talk about it as if that is America's free speech. Challenges in these algorithms to whether or not we can even, redefining or reauthorizing, the Civil Rights Act or the Equal Employment Act and so forth. And so this leads to this idea that because technology design is so powerful, I claim that we live in that our democracy has been turned over to a kind of technocracy, where the design of the technology dictates the rules we live by. Now, I didn't invent that term. The term comes from 100 years ago, right after the second industrial revolution, and the country's trying to figure out, how to move forward with all the new technology of its time, electricity and cars, and almost all the technologies we totally take for granted were brand new, and they all came at one time. And so this term technocracy came with the idea that people who understood the technology, technocrats, or who understood society, economists and statisticians, should be the ones making governmental decisions. And that's where we get this term technocrat. And there still are government jobs where you have to be in a particular discipline in order to hold a position in that, to hold that job. This use of the word technocracy is not about technocrats. It's a realization that the people who are making decisions end up making those decisions as it's implemented in the design of the technology that we all have to live with. So that's how I would define technocrats and technocracy. One of the examples I would give is the Sony camcorder. So in 1983, Sony comes out with the Sony. Yes, I'm starting to date myself. So Sony comes out with the camcorder, which is the first handheld device that records both video and sound. And it was an amazing marvel of a technology, and you couldn't even keep it on the shelves. Sony is a Japanese company, and one of the things about the design of it was that it had no mute button. Now, at the time it comes to the United States, our laws around whether or not you could record a photograph in public was that you could record a person's photograph without their permission. But our laws around whether or not you could record a conversation was that, oh no, you need people's permission before you go around recording a conversation. But with no mute button, that meant that people right away were going to be violating the law. And sure enough, a mother strapped one of those camcorders to her child, and he's on the school bus, and the camcorder records all these kind of atrocities happening to him with respect from the school bus driver. And she takes the recording down to the police, and they arrest her for illegal wiretapping. There was a protest at Boston University, and the person on the sidewalk was recording a police officer arresting the protester. And the policeman stops arresting the protester, turns around and arrests the guy with the camcorder. And he faced 7 years in prison for illegal wiretapping. Now we fast forward to today. Pennsylvania passed a law requiring a camera with sound to record all school buses. And the ACLU took that case of the observed protester and won us all the right to record the police in the service of their duty. So I give that example because it was a kind of arbitrary design decision that led to that. One of the things about technology is when a design works, it keeps getting replicated. And so even today, most of us record a video using a smartphone, but the smartphone also has no mute button. And so, and even though now all it would cost is just a software update.
Okay, I wanted to go back a little bit where you talked about, you know, in the definition of technocracy, and there's this this statement that you made. Well, I don't know if these are your words, and maybe it's my interpretation of what you were saying. So you talk about how basically technology, or the design of technology, basically defining policy. And so I want, what do you see as the issues, you know, that will be the outcome of, you know, policy, technology driven policy?
Oh my gosh. I mean, you look today, I mean, I have a long list of about 50, you know, policies that have been redefined by technology. So, you know, everything from the Civil Rights Act, you know, when recidivism algorithms, you know, if recidivism, I don't even know where to start. Let me see. Let me start with another story about online ads. And I think that can really help us further the story. So my life has been just very odd. It just seems like I get to these places early. I do a simple experiment, and then 1,000 great minds come after me and begin helping. So data privacy and the Weld experiment was one such example. The next time that was to happen to me, I had just become a professor at Harvard, and I'm being interviewed by a reporter. And we were talking, and I wanted to show him one of my papers. So I typed my name into the Google search bar, and up popped the link I was looking for. He said, "Forget the link. Tell me about the time you were arrested." I said, "I wasn't arrested. I've never been arrested." He says, "Then why does your computer say you have?" And what he's pointing to is an ad that says LaTanya Sweeney arrested. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And we go back and forth and back and forth, him asking me all kinds of questions. Eventually, I click the link. I pay the $89 for an annual subscription to the company and show him that not only do I not have an arrest record in that database, no one with my name has an arrest record with in that database. But he and I began playing around and really trying to understand what makes these arrest ads show up. Because when I typed in his name, it just says looking for more information. He just got a neutral ad. And eventually we realized that you had to have a real name, a first and last name of a real person. But eventually we learned that much that day, but I was determined to find out what it was about. So I ended up doing a full-scale experiment, capture 150,000 ads using a VPN network across the country to figure out what was behind these ads. And what I learned was that if your name was given more often to a Black baby than a white baby, these ads came up, you were 80% more likely to get one of these ads, irregardless of whether or not you had an arrest record, or they had an arrest record in your name, or anybody else with your name. And what's interesting about that 80%, 20% split is that discrimination in the United States is not illegal. But what is illegal are certain groups in certain situations. One of those groups is Blacks, and one of those situations is employment. And that means that if there are two people who are going for a job and the potential employer types in their names to see what's online about them, that the person whose first name is given more often to Black babies is at a disadvantage if these ads pop up than their competitor. And the Department of Justice says it doesn't matter. The Civil Rights Act says it doesn't matter why or who's to blame. It just that the adverse impact happens. And the Department of Justice uses an 80-20 rule as the basis for saying whether or not a civil rights investigation should occur. So this was the first time an algorithm, in this case Google's ad network, was held up to be in violation of, or at least eligible for investigation under the Civil Rights Act. So now to pull that question back into what Dr. Hill brings up. So what does it mean if that experiment never happens? That means that we can't enforce the Civil Rights Act. What does it mean that the Department of Justice doesn't do this routinely? So if there are other ways in which those things are being violated, we don't have a way to enforce the Civil Rights Act online. So then we begin to ask, then the limits of the Civil Rights Act only have to do with offline. So similarly with ads, credit ads, when I was the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission, we did similar kind of experiments around what kind of ads are shown to people whose experience, goes to primarily websites that people of one particular race or one particular income or certain combinations go to. And we were again able to find these issues where in certain communities, the only ads you ever get for a credit card are horrible ads. You only get the worst credit card ads. Whereas another group who's comparable to you in income and educational level and credit worthiness in general is getting much better ads. And so, but how do you enforce that? Unless you're doing those experiments, unless we teach the government and others who would protect us how to do these experiments, then we're left to the design of in this case, the Google ad network. And of course, it keeps going on and on as you begin to look at algorithmic bias. These AI algorithms are being used so widely. And even when they're in violation of a law like the Equal Employment Act or so forth, how do we make your case if there's a bias in the algorithm and it only likes young people, and it never refers anything but young people to an employer, and the employer even may have that bias. On the outside, there's no way for any of us to know that, even though we have a law that says that's illegal. So these things begin, I could go on and on. It's just a long, long list. But these things really underscore this notion that somehow technology and this design has become the kind of policymaker. They're the ones making these rules. They're deciding that our old laws, they don't count anymore. And that's why I use the term technocracy.
And I think what you're doing is that you're explaining to us, you've broken it down and made it plain why we all need to be concerned about technology, interested in technology, engaging in our own ways of doing what you describe as small experiments, but have such a huge impact on our understanding of how these technological tools are being applied, in our daily lives and the impact that they have on us, right? There's a wealth of research that talks about, discrimination in hiring. And now just imagine all of this is digital. So usually it's when you look at the resume and you see the name, but what if there's nothing about the name? All the information that we're sharing online and the things that we can learn about you based on what you share. And even when you don't share specific things, we can make inferences about what, your religion is, your sexual orientation, all of those, your age, they may not be available, but just from the data that we find about you, given the algorithms, we can actually make inferences about what that is. Based on your music choices, we can determine like whether you're male or female, whether you're in this age range or not. And so that, drives like, it's no longer, it's like you have to show up and people know who you are. I can actually, with high prediction, determine who you are. And so when we have these algorithms and the use of these algorithms, and they can be used in such an unfair way, or they can enable unfairness and bias, it gives us all reason to be concerned and be interested, in this new technology. So
and what happened, and I just want to say, so it's what, and then you could flip it around. It happens the other way too. So you just described quite beautifully, what happens when the technology is just telling more about me than they're entitled to know, or that I revealed myself, or and so forth. But what happens when the technology is wrong?
Yes.
What happens when it says you're a credit risk and you're not? What happens when it says you're a criminal risk and you're not? I have I had a research assistant who was a young Asian American woman who really liked Beyonce a lot. And so on Facebook decided she was a Black woman, and there was nothing she could do. There was no group she could join that was going to change this characterization of her. And I just, and the ads she got and so forth. So when the technology is wrong, there's no appeal process, there's no, but that's not me. And even though this example of her, because of her love for Beyonce, being assumed to be a Black woman, the thing about that is, but when it's something else like your credit worthiness or something that can be quite devastating, we also have the same lack of transparency, the same lack of correction.
So and that is so true. I mean, we see this, we see algorithms being used for facial recognition, and as you mentioned earlier, to determine sentences for offenses, and the information that's actually being used in order to determine that, to be used to determine where we're actually going to put the next fresh produce grocery store. So there are all these reasons for us to be concerned about, these algorithms and how they're used. And so I also want to, before we move on, as we're talking about, algorithmic fairness, I remember you and I, we were attending a meeting together. And so, you had just flown back in from France. And so I was like, and I was so happy to see you. I was like, LaTanya, where you been? I was like, oh, I was just meeting with, President Macron. So tell us about that. Tell us, tell us a little bit about that. Share about that.
Well, you first of all, you have to realize what it was like. I get this email from some guy who claims he's the president of France inviting me to dinner, even though it was nicely worded and stuff. Clearly that's trash mail, right? So I just ignored it. Then it came back again. I put it in the junk mail. I think the third or fourth time I put in the junk mail. Eventually I get a visit from the French consulate in Boston who says, no, that was actually real email. So it was a fantastic experience. I went to, I had the opportunity to have like, what was it, a 3 or 4 hour dinner with the president of France to talk about algorithmic fairness and algorithmic bias. And the issue that he was facing was very interesting. There is a company whose name I won't say, but there's a company who's come up with a fantastic algorithm for predicting your illness. So if it knows various things about your health record, it can predict that if you don't make changes, what's likely to happen to you, and it's reasonably good. The problem with this particular algorithm is that it needs lots of historical medical records. So the only countries that this is eligible for are pretty much countries who have had socialized medicine for a while. And so France was one such company. So the company says, okay, so if you send us all of your data, meaning all of the French people's data for decades, if you send it to us, we'll be able to tell you how you could save more lives and reduce your costs. And he says, yeah, well, how about you just bring your algorithm and bring your little computer over here and you guys compute on our data. And they were like, no, you ship the data to us. And so that was the beginning of him really trying to understand what is the state of these algorithms, what is going on. Anyway, so we began looking at the full spectrum of algorithms and bias in data and how the bias in data replicates itself in the algorithm, except now you think the algorithm's impartial and mathematically sound when it's just basically spitting out the same biases. So the next day he made an announcement, and his announcement was that algorithms that were used for decision making would be open, and that the data would also be open for inspection as well. And this was sort of the first stance, and then Germany followed suit. And in fact, the EU continues along the path of more transparency in algorithms that are used in decision making, and how do you audit an algorithm and things like that. Something that I think the United States is maybe slowly moving towards.
Okay. Yeah, I love the story, when you shared it with me, and the fact that you had just returned from France, and you shared the picture at the time, and that was just amazing. And I know that I'm going to be mindful of the time, and I'm going to prepare to receive questions from the audience. I'm going to take about another 5 minutes. And so you talked about your time at the Federal Trade Commission. And so one of the things that you looked at while you were there also was just mobile apps and data sharing.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think, when it comes down to, mobile devices, it is all hope lost, with regards to an individual having control over who can access his or her data. Is all hope lost in this? Because, or have we gotten to the point where we just expect our data to be exfiltrated from the phones, and that we have no control over it because we give it all away because we actually want to use the apps?
It's such a myth that somehow we have control. I'm not a privacy advocate. I'm still at heart that same graduate student who wants society to enjoy the benefits of technology, but without the harms. But in my work in data privacy, I clearly have hung out with a lot of advocates. And so I had this one friend, privacy advocate, and he was determined not to use a cell phone because of the kind of work we had done at the FTC, showing how much information about you, like your location every 10 seconds, and just all kinds of data leaked out by your phone. So he just wasn't having any part of it. So one day he had to fly from DC. He lived in DC, to fly from DC to Boston, and he was running late. So he needed to call to say he was late. And there were no payphones. He could not find a payphone in the Boston airport. So he had to beg a stranger, can I use your phone so that I can make a call to say I'm 15 minutes late? And so at this point, he realized he had no choice. He had to get a cell phone. He had to get a mobile phone because our society demanded that. And that's what we are. I mean, we can't really live without these technologies. They're not really optional. If you don't have a LinkedIn page, it's hard to be, in many professions, for you to be considered seriously without a LinkedIn page. And so as a result, if we can't live without these technologies, they're not optional. But yet our policies pretend they're optional. They pretend that you opted in. they pretend that you had a choice that you didn't have. And so as we're moving forward, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to come up and we're developing strategies that do either give back individuals more control, give individuals more competition, or address the inequities in the relationship.
And so I think what you're telling me, and I always like to hear this, that there is good news, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to be like the Georgia Southern pastor. There is good news, because I think sometimes when I think about data privacy, and I'm a privacy phobe, I'm like, okay, don't share so much information. I'm always telling the students that, and I think I was like, oh, Dr. Hill is on her soapbox. We're not going to be able to live. She's always chastising us for sharing and everything. And I probably preach a little doom and gloom, and things of that nature, but we don't want anyone to leave this conversation thinking that all hope is lost, right? That there is good news.
Yeah.
And I think that you have been engaged in creating that good news, and that good news is that we all can be a part of the solution.
Right. I
And
mean, absolutely. So when I left the FTC, I started thinking about ways that in my life, I had big impact. And so it was the Weld experiment. It was the discrimination in online ads. It was finding those bots in 2016 that were doing all the disinformation. It was finding vulnerabilities in voter websites in 2006. But each one of those things were simple experiments. They weren't rocket science, right? They were at a particular way of looking for the unforeseen, and that I could teach people how to do this. So when I went back to Harvard, I started an undergraduate class, which eventually the students renamed to the Save the World class. But the idea of the Save the World class is that we just take some of these problems and we solve them. We do an experiment. We just do these experiments that expose the problems. So and right away from the first semester I taught this class, big things happen. So let me give you an example. Students were able to show that if you were an Asian host and a white host in Berkeley or Oakland, California, the Asian host made about 20% less. And a professor had shown that if you were black on Airbnb, if you were a black host and a white host, the black host made about 12% less for comparable properties in comparable locations. Airbnb responded by changing its platform. When you go to Airbnb now, they set the price in order to compensate for that. That's pretty cool. The students were able to, we had one student who was able to show how Facebook Messenger leaked your GPS location. And so he added a plugin on people's browser that you could see where friends and friends were at the time they would leave messages. We had like 90,000 downloads of that little simple plugin. And within a week, Facebook stopped, changed its platform so that it no longer included the GPS, share the GPS location of friends and friends of friends for that reason. And that was something that the industry had been trying to get Facebook to do for 2 years. But this student, an undergraduate student, got this done in less than 7 days. And I could go on. There have been laws passed, regulations changed, and the students continue to have impact. And there's nothing special about, I mean, in my heart, obviously Harvard students are special, but beyond my heart, there's nothing special about them in this regard. And so we've been working and trying to get other students to do these same kind of unforeseen experiments. There's so many more experiments than we have people. And it's a great opportunity, I think, for many to be able to begin to shape and push back and change and really literally change the formula, sort of restoring democracy, getting our democracy back from that technocracy that we talked about earlier. So I just want to say, so one of my real reasons for being particularly excited, other than talking to Raquel, which I will do at any time, I'll always take that invitation. But I'm also really honored to be here because this talk isn't really about me, and it's not even about my students. The talk is really about you and the challenge and the opportunity that you have to do this same work and kind of save the world.
And I love that. I love the class. When I was on sabbatical at Harvard, you know, I sat in on the class and it was amazing. You would throw out a problem, the students would go away for about 10 minutes, and then they would, and these were diverse groups of students. There were policy students, there were applied math students, there were computer scientists, and they would come back together and they would propose their solutions, and it was just amazing. And they got really excited because these were real world issues about technology that affected them, and how, you know, how better to inspire students to become engaged. So we're about at 15 minutes remaining, and I want to begin looking at some of the questions that we have so far. And so our first question is, what are some ways we can prepare our youth for a future profession in technology?
Well, I mean, and one set of answer is to be on the lookout for the unforeseen and to just do well in the things that you're passionate about. Because one of the things that has happened in the Save the World class is you didn't have to come, we take anybody from any discipline. And all you have to know is what is your craft. And some of the best work has been done by people from the history of science, or even from artists who've done some amazing installations to really reveal. There's a place for everyone in this storyline. So it's not so much a training in terms of the work that I do. It's not so much a training around a discipline as much as it's a training to learn how to use your discipline in an effective way. But in general, I mean, obviously exposure is incredibly important for our youth to both be exposed to technology and to also be able to master it. And so anything that we can do to keep pushing that kind of knowledge in is a fantastic thing.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, Dr. Sweeney, is the ability to sue an algorithm in your discrimination in online ad delivery? I'm also wondering who actually gets sued. Is it the company using the algorithm or the developer?
So this is a great question. So first of all, we'd have to say who the heck was responsible for these online ads, and so in the case of the online ads, is it Google's algorithm that's the bias? Is it the advertiser? Did they put biased ads in? Was it society? Because the way Google rewards an ad is if people click on the ad, it gets shown more often. And so could it be that it was a reflection of society clicking arrest ads if your name was given more often to a Black baby than a white baby? And so the answer is that there's a little bit of evidence to go around, though the FTC did fine the original company. Google did kick those ads off its platform and then eventually off of the thousands of other websites that they serve the ads to. But in terms of your question of who can I sue? So I like this question a lot because we're starting to see more and more class action lawsuits being hit against tech companies. And what you have to be able to answer is, can you show harm? So in the case of the online ad algorithm, that harm would have been, you know, if I had been able to show that I was, in fact, I didn't get my job at Harvard because somebody saw that ad. So the harm can be difficult to demonstrate. And so in that way, it can put a limit on the harms. There are other instruments, though, to be able to represent groups of people. So lawsuits are not out of the question.
Okay, so the next question is by a dear friend of mine. Hello, Adon. I must say hello to you. He's my little brother. He says, you are both amazing. You are too, Adon. Given all that has been revealed with respect to biases and algorithms in online services, do you think we've crossed the threshold to require public APIs to make citizen experiments and public oversight to be easier to do?
Oh, I wish it were so. I mean, at the heart of technocracy is, at the heart of technocracy is the use of our free market system as a kind of policymaker, right? And part of the protection of the free market system says that as a company produces an algorithm, that algorithm may be used in a very egregious way and may have lots of bias. And you want to show it, but they say, but it's our intellectual property. Sorry, you don't get to see it. Well, what about that data that you trained on? I want to know if that was where the bias came from. Sorry, that's private property. And so this idea of trying to make that public, here in the United States, it would be monumental unless we do it through the lens, kind of like the way France sort of introduced it, saying, but if we're using it for criminal justice, if we're using it where someone's freedom is at stake, we're using it when somebody's finances is at stake, then if you're going to use that algorithm in that setting, then you have to make some guarantees, or we have to be able to audit you. I think in that way we can get to it, but a general blanket public API is probably not going to work.
Okay, so the next question is, are you saying privacy, at least data privacy, is a myth? If so, what sort of practices should we advocate for in our data lives? Avoid taking pictures in public, keep our money in a paper bag under the mattress, only consume alcohol in the privacy of our own home? Thank you for that question.
Well, so I'm saying both. I'm having my cake and eat it too. On the one hand, we have made significant progress in data privacy. There are some guarantees, mathematical guarantees we can make in some data sharing environments. Those data sharing environments and those mathematical guarantees aren't what most of us are talking about when we're talking about privacy, though. And so there's all kinds of privacy, right? There's your health data, there's whether or not I use this phone and the phone is sending other kinds of data. There's just all kinds of data arrangements. There's no one, we don't even have a comprehensive privacy law in the United States. So it's whatever goes. And so in that regard, we don't have an answer to privacy. We don't have a comprehensive answer. And we don't even have individual action. The days for which you can say, I'm going to protect my privacy, are you can't. I'll give you another example. The online ads happen to a person, even if that person has never been online before. So offline data and online data are fused. So it's not even like you have individual action that you could take to completely protect yourself. And there's some things you can do. But at the same time, if the goal is for us to enjoy the benefits of the technology without the problems, then that's the space of solutions that we need to be pushing towards and working on.
So the next question is a question for me, and I'm not sure if I'm the one for this question, since I am not a part of our technology services, but I'll read the question. It says, a question for Dr. Hill. Spelman uses a number of third-party integrations that collect student information, personal and non-personal, by US definition, that are introduced to students without explaining to students their ability for opting out or providing simple mechanisms for them to do so. How does Spelman separate itself from other companies that trick their users into opting into their policies? So I'm not aware of the applications that you reference in this question. I think that this is definitely a question for our Chief Information Officer. And so, but I would say Spelman is not about tricking someone into sharing information and opting into policies. without the individual being informed about what it is that you are doing. And so if you have such concerns, I think that you can talk to me about the specifics of what your concerns are, the types of data, and then I will go with you to talk with our Chief Information Officer about those concerns and help you to articulate those concerns. Because I'm all about your privacy and you having as much control over your information as you should have. Okay, so the next question says, what impact has the digital divide had on African-American women enterprises? And do you think COVID-19 has widened the gap?
Well, I mean, the pandemic has definitely exposed the digital divide, right? I mean, everything from from schools being closed to having children be able to get online, having technology that they can use online sufficiently to even engage on Zoom and in courses. So the pandemic has done a tremendous amount. We have a project called Vax Direct that's also looking at right now, if you want a vaccine in the United States, almost in every state and almost everyone has to go to a public website to sign up, to get an appointment, and so forth. There are a few exceptions, but that's pretty much how the bulk of everyone is getting a vaccination. But if you want a vaccination and you don't have access to the internet, what are you supposed to do? Or if you want a vaccination and you're not internet savvy, like maybe you're older and you're just not used to using the internet, what do you do? And so this is a problem caused by the digital divide that we're trying to solve by actually using a telephone to call people and say, do you want a vaccine? And if you do want a vaccine, I will we'll make an appointment for you, or we'll use this technology to get you an appointment. And so I do think this issue around the digital divide is absolutely huge.
So final question, I think we're approaching the end. If black box algorithms are essentially filters imposed on the information we see without our consent, how do you feel about fighting surveillance capitalism by supporting platforms that give individuals both visibility on their own data and manual control of their feeds? Have you seen platforms whose models you like?
Well, we have true confession, we have one of those models. I'll just give a shout out to it, mydatacan.org. So I'll just say it again, mydatacan.org. So what is the challenge of such a platform? We use the technology not because of its data sharing practices. We use the technology because of other benefits it gives. And so if we really want to transform the world, we've got to either get those platforms to be more respectful of our data and give us more individual control and so forth, or we've got to take platforms like MyDataCan and get them to do exciting apps and exciting web services. Because the more exciting things they do, people will come and start using them more, and that will change the formula. So that's the idea of these algorithms. And we're not the only one. There's a couple of other models out there as well, where people are trying to force a choice around data privacy. But that success is really going to depend on whether or not you've got killer apps. Are you going to give me these great benefits I want?
So, Latanya, I wanted to give you an opportunity to say any closing words that you may have.
Well, I think I would, I hope that from this talk, one, you find this space exciting, that you learn to look for the unforeseen in technology, document it in a scientifically verifiable way, and you too can change the world. And I think that you really are the future. The other part of this future, though, is the internet, and this notion of technocracy that we see today is about to change in a really big way. And I want you to be a part of that too. Right now, the vision of these technologies are primarily the result of some young white guys deciding to build technology in the vision for themselves and for their friends. And to the extent it's worked for lots of us, that's fantastic. But ultimately, that's kind of the model that's often been in their mind. But there are many more millions of people who are not on the internet, but who will be soon. And those are people in the Southern Hemisphere. And when they come onto the internet, they're going to have to be, technology is going to have to be accessible to them. It's going to have to be around programs and apps and things like that that they want. So in some ways, a new internet will emerge. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but you all could be a part of helping shape that. And that would be incredibly powerful.
So I want to end with this. I've actually perused some of your creative writings. And so
Oh no!
I'm going to take an excerpt from something that you said, because you inspire with all that you've pioneered and what you call your little experiments and what they have made us think about collectively. And this is just like one stanza. I will teach you and show you. We will share times good and bad. Your first step, your first words will make me smile again. When you fall as you must, I will rise you to your feet. You grace my life with meaning and make my soul complete. And your passion for technology, your passion for uncovering, all of the policy related issues and challenging us to think about these technologies in new ways, that passion makes my soul complete. I just want to thank you for all that you do and all that you continue to do to inspire us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you all.
Wow, those were perfect words to end on, Raquel. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, Latanya, for being with us today. It was the perfect way to wrap up what has been an amazing speaker series, leaving us on a high note, helping us to remember that we can be a part of the creation of our future. I think that's a really important thing to remember, that the world that we currently live in is something that has been created and can be recreated to be better than what it is right now. So with that, I want to thank everybody so much for participating in this wonderful event this evening with Dr. Raquel Hill from Spelman College and Dr. Latanya Sweeney from Harvard University. And with that, I will bid you a good evening. Have a wonderful night. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.